After my husband's affair with my best friend, I lost it all: my job, my home, even my confidence. He told me I'd never get back up. While living in a rundown motel, I discovered a dusty suitcase with my name on it. Inside was $70,000 in cash, a plane ticket, and a note that said, "This is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address." When I arrived, what I saw changed everything. I still remember the crushing weight of that moment, the disbelief scorching my lungs as I watched my entire world shatter. Imagine walking into your own home, into your own bedroom, only to find the two people you trusted most tangled in a web of betrayal so deep it reached back years, even touching the darkest corners of your family's history. 7 months ago, my life was, well, it was normal. I had a husband, Justin, a best friend I'd known since college, Natalie, and a job that, while not my dream, paid the bills and offered a sense of stability. Fast forward to now, and I was living in a motel room that charged by the week, eating instant ramen that cost less than $2, and desperately trying to piece together a life from freelance scraps. My husband Justin and my best friend Natalie, they'd been sleeping together for who knows how long. When I caught them, everything imploded with such calculated precision, it felt like a coordinated attack. Within 2 weeks, I lost my job. The divorce left me with practically nothing. Friends I thought I could count on just stopped calling. In less than 2 months, I went from a comfortable, middle-class existence to absolute rock bottom. So, there I was, sitting on the edge of a bed that groaned a complaint with every breath I took, slurping down lukewarm instant ramen with a flimsy plastic fork. That's when I noticed it, a forgotten suitcase tucked away under the bed. It was old, made of brown leather with brass corners tarnished green with age, and a small luggage tag tied with twine. My full name was written on it, in handwriting I knew instantly, Aunt Helen's. Aunt Helen. She'd died 9 months earlier, the eccentric, difficult aunt, the one everyone called paranoid. I pulled the suitcase out, found a small key taped to the bottom, and opened it. Inside, it wasn't old clothes or forgotten trinkets. It was $7,000 in cash. And a note. A note that didn't just explain what had happened, it completely rewrote everything I thought I knew about my entire life. It warned me. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. It said they'd been planning my destruction since before my wedding. It stated, with chilling certainty, that my mother's death 6 years ago wasn't an accident. And then, it directed me to an address in Portland, where the real fortune was waiting. It ended with an instruction: finish what your mother started, before they silenced her. Helen had spent her final years gathering evidence, while everyone around her dismissed her as crazy. Now, from beyond the grave, she was giving me a choice: take the money and disappear, or use it to fight back against the very people who had systematically destroyed everything I held dear. My name is Samantha Garrett. Before everything fell apart, my life was so predictably normal I never even thought to question it. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where people still smiled and greeted each other. Mrs. Chin, down the hall, always had a kind word. The maintenance guy actually fixed things when they broke. The apartment wasn't luxurious. The walls were thin enough that I could hear our neighbors' TV shows at night, and the carpet had stains from previous tenants that stubbornly resisted every scrub. But Justin and I had painted the living room together, spent an entire Saturday wrestling with flat-pack furniture, and hung wedding photos where the afternoon light made everything look warmer than it probably was. It was home. I worked as a marketing coordinator at Brennan & Associates, a mid-sized firm downtown. We handled campaigns for small businesses, social media for family restaurants, website redesigns for dental offices, email marketing for little boutique shops. It wasn't the glamorous career I'd envisioned after college, but it paid a steady $48,000 a year plus benefits. Enough for my half of the rent, groceries, and an occasional dinner out when Justin and I wanted to pretend we had more disposable income than we did. My boss, Marcus Brennan, was professional but detached. The kind of supervisor who complimented your work in meetings but somehow never managed to promote you. He'd ask about your weekend, but his eyes would already be scanning the next item on his agenda. I'd been there for years, consistently getting performance reviews that praised my reliability, yet never translated into raises or advancement. But I didn't question it. I showed up at 8:30 every morning, made coffee from the sputtering machine in the break room, sat at my desk with its view of the parking lot, and did my job. It felt stable, predictable, safe. Justin was a business consultant. Or so he said. His schedule was always chaotic, late nights on proposals, weekend trips to Seattle or San Francisco, conference calls at odd hours with East Coast clients. He'd come home exhausted, kiss my forehead, warm up whatever leftovers were in the fridge, and collapse on the couch, laptop still open. I'd cover him with a blanket, feeling this strange mix of affection and loneliness. Proud that he worked so hard, but resentful of how little time we actually spent together. We'd met 7 years ago at a dinner party, thrown by mutual friends. Or so I believed. He was charming that night, asked intelligent questions about my work, actually listened to my answers. He made jokes that were clever without being mean. He even offered to help clean up. He asked for my number at the end of the night, and I gave it to him, trying to appear nonchalant. Our courtship felt natural, easy, like we were perfectly matched. Dinners at cozy restaurants, walks through the city, lazy Sunday mornings reading newspapers in bed. He proposed after 18 months in the same park where we'd had our third date. I said yes without a second thought. I couldn't imagine a reason not to. But in the last 2 years, things had shifted. Subtly. I noticed, but I convinced myself it was normal. Justin became more protective of his phone, tilting the screen away when I walked by, taking calls in other rooms, placing it face down on the table during dinner. He got vague about work projects, offering broad descriptions instead of the detailed stories he used to share. He started picking fights over the silliest things, the way I loaded the dishwasher, whether we needed organic vegetables, how much time I spent talking to Natalie. Natalie, my best friend since college. We were broke students then, splitting ramen packets, dreaming about the futures we'd build. She was my maid of honor, stood beside me in the dress we'd picked out, cried during the ceremony in a way that made me cry too. She helped us move into our apartment, lugging boxes up 3 flights of stairs, making jokes about our accumulated clutter. Every Thursday night for the past 5 years, she'd come over with a bottle of wine. We'd sit on my couch, talking about everything, work frustrations, her latest dating disasters, my growing worries about Justin and me drifting apart. She listened with what seemed like genuine sympathy, nodding in all the right places, saying things like, "All marriages go through phases, you two just need to reconnect." She'd tell me how lucky I was to have found someone like Justin, how most men weren't as supportive or steady, how I shouldn't take what I had for granted. I believed her. Because questioning your best friend feels like questioning reality itself. If you can't trust the person who's been beside you through every major life event for over a decade, then who can you trust? My mother, Catherine, had died 6 years earlier. Car accident, rainy night. Her car wrapped around a tree on a road she'd driven hundreds of times. The police said she was speeding, maybe fell asleep. A tragic accident. My Aunt Helen, my mother's older sister, insisted something was wrong with the official story, but everyone dismissed her concerns as grief. Helen had always been the difficult one, showing up to family gatherings with pamphlets about corporate corruption, warning us about trusting the wrong people. When she died 9 months ago, alone in her house, surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers, I felt guilty. Guilty for not visiting more, for not taking her seriously, for writing her off as paranoid when maybe, just maybe, she saw patterns the rest of us were too comfortable to notice. I went to work every day, paid my bills on time, kept the apartment clean, tried to be a good wife. I did everything right according to the unwritten rules of middle-class respectability. I thought if I just worked hard enough, trusted the right people, and played by the rules, I'd be protected from the kind of chaos you read about happening to other people. I thought doing everything right mattered. That loyalty meant something. That the life I'd built was real, solid, and mine. Looking back now, from this motel room with its cigarette-stained walls and a bed that squeaks with every movement, I can see how incredibly naive that was. How carefully constructed my entire life had been by people who saw me as useful, not human. How every relationship I'd trusted had been a performance, designed to keep me compliant and unsuspecting. The apartment, the job, the marriage, the friendship. All of it built on foundations that were never real to begin with. But I didn't know that yet. Not then. Not 7 months ago, sitting in my normal life, believing in routine and the protection of rules that turned out to be written by people who had no intention of following them. I didn't know that Justin and Natalie had been planning my destruction since before my wedding. I didn't know my mother's death wasn't an accident. I didn't know Aunt Helen had spent her final years collecting evidence while everyone dismissed her as crazy. I didn't know any of it until I found that suitcase with $70,000 and a note that offered me a choice: disappear or fight back. And by then, I'd already lost everything I thought mattered. The suitcase lay on the motel bed beside me, $70,000 in cash spread out like evidence at a crime scene. Helen's note was still clutched in my hand, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. I read it again, trying to absorb words that rewrote my entire history. They'd been planning this since before my wedding. My mother's death wasn't an accident. Finish what she started before they silenced her. I needed to understand. How had I missed it? How had I lived inside this lie for 7 years without seeing the truth? So I let myself remember that Tuesday, 6 months ago, when my comfortable illusions finally shattered beyond repair. I'd woken up that morning feeling sick to my stomach. Not the kind of nausea from bad food or the flu, but something deeper. A profound wrongness that sat in my chest and made it hard to breathe. I tried to ignore it, going through my normal routine. Shower. Puffy toast I couldn't finish. Getting dressed for work while Justin slept in because he'd had a late meeting the night before. By 10 a.m., I was at my desk at Brennan and Associates, staring at a social media calendar for a dental office, unable to focus. My hands felt cold. My heart raced for no reason I could name. The nausea worsened. Finally, I walked into Marcus's office and told him I needed to go home. I expected him to argue. Marcus wasn't the type to appreciate people leaving midday, even when legitimately sick. But he just looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher and said, "Feel better," in a tone that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Like he already knew something I didn't. Like he was relieved I was leaving. The drive home took 20 minutes through midday traffic. I kept the radio off. Noise felt like too much. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just a stomach bug, and anxiety was making it worse. But the dread grew with every block. A certainty that something was wrong, even though I had no logical reason to feel that way. When I pulled into the parking lot of our apartment building, I saw Natalie's car. A silver Honda Civic, one I'd ridden in hundreds of times. She had a key to our apartment, sometimes stopped by during the day if her internet was down. It shouldn't have been strange. But on a Tuesday afternoon, when Justin was supposed to be at the office and Natalie at her own apartment, something about it felt deeply, profoundly wrong. I sat in my car for a full minute, engine running, trying to talk myself out of the gut feeling. They're probably working on something. Maybe planning a surprise for me. Maybe Justin came home sick, too, and Natalie stopped by to check on him. I cycled through a dozen innocent explanations, each one more desperate than the last. Finally, I turned off the engine and walked to the building, up 3 flights of stairs. The elevator was broken again, down the hallway with its worn carpet and flickering light. I put my key in the lock as quietly as possible, though I couldn't have said why stealth felt necessary. The apartment was quiet when I stepped inside. Not the empty kind of quiet, but the occupied kind, where you sense people are home even if you can't hear them. I stood in the living room, work bag still over my shoulder, listening. That's when I heard it. Laughter. Coming from our bedroom. Natalie's laughter. But not her usual laugh, the one she used when we watched comedies or I said something funny. This was different. Lower. More intimate. The kind of laugh meant for someone specific, designed to make them feel special and desired. I'd heard her use it before, years ago, when she was dating someone she really liked. Back in college, when everything felt less complicated. I stood frozen in my own living room, staring at the closed bedroom door, my brain scrambling to construct any explanation that would let me keep believing in the life I thought I had. Maybe she's on the phone. Maybe Justin isn't even home. But deep down, beneath all the desperate rationalizations, I already knew. I knew what I was going to find. I crossed the living room, each step feeling like an hour. I didn't knock. Why would I knock on my own bedroom door? I just turned the handle and pushed it open. Justin and Natalie were in my bed. Tangled in the gray sheets I'd washed 3 days earlier, looking at each other with an intimacy that doesn't develop in an afternoon. This was familiar territory for them. Comfortable. Routine. When they saw me in the doorway, the first emotion on Natalie's face wasn't shame or guilt. It was annoyance. Like I was the one interrupting something important, rather than discovering that my husband and my best friend had been systematically betraying me. She didn't scramble to cover herself. She didn't apologize. She just looked at me with an expression that said, "Why are you making this dramatic when you've seen this coming?" Justin got out of bed, pulling on his jeans with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me this wasn't his first quick exit from an awkward situation. That realization hit harder than the initial shock. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was routine for them. Something they'd done enough times that the mechanics had become smooth, automatic. He looked at me with an expression that was somehow worse than guilt. It was impatience, mixed with relief. As if this confrontation was an inconvenience, but also something he'd been waiting for, because pretending had gotten tiresome. "Sam," he said, in that calm voice he used when he thought I was being unreasonable, "we need to talk about this like adults. This isn't what it looks like." The sheer absurdity of that statement almost made me laugh. It was exactly what it looked like. But he stood there in our bedroom, caught in the most obvious betrayal imaginable, and tried to gaslight me into questioning my own eyes. Like I was the one creating a problem by refusing to accept his twisted version of reality. Natalie sat up, holding the sheet around herself with a modesty that would have been funny if it hadn't been so insulting. She had the nerve to look at me with something close to pity. "We didn't want you to find out this way," she said, as if there was a good way to discover your husband and best friend were having an affair. "But honestly, Sam, this has been coming for a long time. You had to know things weren't working between you two." The presumption in that statement stole my breath. Not just that she'd been sleeping with Justin, but that she thought I should have known. That this was somehow predictable, or even my fault for not noticing sooner. That their betrayal was justified because my marriage had problems I'd been too stupid or blind to recognize. I asked the question I knew I'd regret asking. "How long?" My voice sounded strange to me, too calm, too detached, like I was asking about something that didn't matter. Justin answered in the same emotionless tone, like he was discussing a business arrangement that had run its course. "Does it matter?" "Long enough that we're sure about this. Long enough that pretending became harder than being honest." That word, pretending, it cut through me worse than anything else. How long had he been pretending to love me? How long had every kiss goodbye been a performance? Every "I love you" a lie? And Natalie, how long had she been sitting on my couch every Thursday night, drinking my wine, listening to me talk about my marriage problems, offering advice designed to keep me complacent, while she was sleeping with my husband the rest of the week? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things. I just turned around, walked back into the living room, and started stuffing clothes into a duffel bag I pulled from the hall closet. My laptop. Chargers. Toiletries. The practical things you need to survive when your life implodes. Justin followed me, still shirtless, still trying to have that adult conversation, still acting like this was a reasonable situation that could be resolved with calm discussion. I left without saying another word. Walked out of the apartment I'd helped pay for. Drove to a coffee shop parking lot 3 miles away and sat in my car, crying until I couldn't breathe. Then I called my cousin Emma and asked if I could sleep on her couch for a few days. That was 6 months ago. And now, sitting in this motel room with Helen's note and $70,000 in cash, I understood. That Tuesday had been even worse than I thought. The betrayal hadn't just been personal. It had been calculated. Planned. Part of something bigger, connecting to my mother's death and whatever Helen had spent her final years investigating. They'd been playing a long game, with my life as the board. And I'd been too trusting, too naive, too desperate to believe in the stability of normal life to see what was happening until it was too late. I'd been on Emma's couch for 5 days when Marcus called. My cousin had been kind enough to let me stay in her guest room. I was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, going to work every day, pretending that sleeping in someone else's house with all my possessions in a duffel bag was just a temporary inconvenience, not a sign my life was collapsing. Marcus asked me to come to his office first thing Monday morning. His voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news. I told myself it was probably a new client project or a performance review. I didn't let myself think about the alternative. I showed up at 8:15, wearing clothes I'd ironed on Emma's board, wanting to look professional and put together, even though I felt like I was barely holding myself intact. Marcus's office door was open. He waved me in with an expression that might have been sympathy, or might have been satisfaction hidden behind a professional mask. "Samantha," he said, gesturing to the chair. "I need to talk to you about some changes in the department." I sat down, hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my face neutral. Marcus shuffled papers on his desk, not quite meeting my eyes. My stomach dropped before he even spoke. "We're restructuring the marketing department due to budget constraints," he said, using that careful corporate language designed to sound official and impersonal. "Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated. We're offering a severance package that should help with the transition." He slid a folder across his desk. I didn't touch it. I just stared at him, my brain screaming, "Not now. Not when everything else is falling apart." "Budget constraints?" I repeated, my voice distant, hollow. "We just signed 3 new clients last month. I've seen the quarterly reports. We're not struggling financially." Marcus's expression didn't change. "These decisions are made at levels above my control, Samantha. I'm sorry, but the decision is final. I wanted to ask if this had anything to do with Justin. Maybe Marcus had heard about the separation and decided I was a liability." But something in his face stopped me. A flicker of discomfort that suggested asking questions wouldn't change anything, only make it more awkward. I took the folder, left his office, and packed up my desk in 20 minutes. Nobody made eye contact. My coworkers suddenly became fascinated with their computer screens or found urgent reasons to be in meetings. By 9 a.m., I was walking out of Brennan and Associates with a cardboard box containing 4 years of my professional life and a severance package that barely covered 2 months of rent. Later, much later, I'd discover that Marcus and Justin had been college roommates. That their connection had always been part of the architecture of my life, unknown to me. That my job had never been secure, always conditional on remaining useful to people whose agendas I didn't understand. But sitting in my car in the parking lot that morning, I just felt the ground shift beneath me again. Another support kicked out while I was still trying to regain balance from the first blow. The divorce proceedings began 2 weeks after I lost my job. Justin hired Elizabeth Hartley, an attorney with a reputation for winning cases through procedural aggression and strategic cruelty. My attorney was court-appointed, a tired man named Gerald Stokes, who seemed to have given up on believing in justice sometime in the previous decade. Elizabeth filed motions that painted me as unstable, irresponsible, potentially dangerous. She used my job loss as evidence of my inability to function. She pointed to my temporary housing, sleeping on my cousin's couch, as proof I couldn't manage my own life. Every detail of my current circumstances became ammunition in a legal strategy designed to justify why Justin deserved to keep everything, and I deserved nothing. The judge, Robert Cunningham, a man in his late 50s, had an efficient way of moving through his docket that suggested he'd already made his decisions before hearing any actual testimony. Every motion Elizabeth filed, Judge Cunningham approved. Every request Gerald made on my behalf, the judge denied with barely a glance. Justin kept our apartment because his name was first on the mortgage, even though I'd contributed equally to the down payment and monthly payments for 5 years. He kept our car because I'd missed 2 payments during the chaos. He kept the furniture we'd bought together, the savings account we'd built, the retirement funds I'd contributed to for years. The settlement left me with my clothing, my laptop, and barely enough money for 3 months of rent for any apartment I could actually afford. The worst part wasn't losing the material possessions. It wasn't even the financial devastation. It was watching Natalie take the stand as a character witness against me. She wore a navy blue designer suit that I recognized immediately. We'd picked it out 2 years earlier during a shopping trip, laughing in dressing rooms. I'd told her it made her look professional and confident. Now, she was wearing it to testify against me. She sat in the witness stand with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, and lied with the kind of conviction that comes from practice. She told Judge Cunningham I'd been unstable for months, that I'd made concerning comments about self-harm, that I'd become increasingly paranoid and difficult. She claimed Justin had stayed in the marriage out of obligation and fear, rather than love. None of it was true. Not a single word. But Natalie delivered each lie with perfect emotional calibration, her voice breaking slightly at the right moments. Her expression showing concern mixed with reluctance, as if testifying against me was painful but necessary for my own good. Judge Cunningham listened, nodding sympathetically, taking notes. When Gerald tried to cross-examine her about her relationship with Justin, Elizabeth objected before he could finish. The judge sustained it immediately, cutting off any line of inquiry that might reveal the affair or Natalie's motivation. I sat at the defendant's table, watching my best friend of over a decade systematically destroy what was left of my credibility. And I understood. This had been coordinated. The affair, the job loss, the divorce proceedings, all timed and executed with a precision that went beyond coincidence. After the divorce finalized, Emma let me stay in her guest room for 3 weeks. Then her husband, David, started making pointed comments. He never said it directly to me, but I'd hear him talking to Emma in their bedroom at night, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "She can't stay here indefinitely. You're not helping her by letting her avoid dealing with her situation." Emma would defend me, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. The exhaustion of dealing with someone else's crisis. I started looking for anywhere else to go before Emma had to ask me to leave. My former colleague, Diane, offered her couch for 10 days, then decided my negative energy was impacting her mental health. A college friend said I could stay with her for a week, then remembered family visiting. Another friend let me crash for 5 days before her roommate complained about a stranger. Everyone was sympathetic, until sympathy became inconvenient. Until supporting me required actual, sustained sacrifice, rather than just kind words and temporary gestures. Then suddenly, they remembered prior commitments, family obligations, personal boundaries. I understood it on some level. Nobody wants to live with someone else's crisis indefinitely. But the speed with which people retracted their support taught me something profound about how conditional most relationships truly are. How quickly compassion expires when it becomes uncomfortable. When I finally scraped together enough money from freelance social media work to pay for a weekly rate at the Crossroads Motel, it felt less like hitting rock bottom and more like finally finding ground that wouldn't shift beneath me. At least the motel didn't pretend to care. Rita, at the front desk, didn't offer false comfort or temporary sympathy that would evaporate when I became inconvenient. Room 14 became my address. My home. The place where I'd eventually find a suitcase containing $70,000 and a note that explained why my destruction had been so systematic and so complete. Room 14 at the Crossroads Motel became my address 3 days after the last friend stopped returning my calls. I'd scrounged $200 from freelance social media work for a local bakery and a pet grooming business, both of which paid in irregular installments. The motel sat off Highway 52, the kind of place where the weekly rate was displayed more prominently than the nightly rate, and the sign out front had been missing letters for so long, no one bothered to fix it. Rita, at the front desk, had an expression that suggested she'd witnessed this exact scenario thousands of times before. Women alone, with duffel bags and desperate eyes, paying weekly rates while pretending this was temporary. She didn't ask questions. She just took my cash, handed me a key attached to a green plastic tag with 14 embossed in fading gold numbers, and recited the rules in a flat voice. Weekly rate includes utilities. Checkout is 11 if you're leaving. No visitors after 10. Laundry room, round back, $3 a load. Vending machines take bills or coins. I thanked her and carried my duffel bag across the parking lot to a door that had been painted blue at some distant point, but had faded to a color that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. The key stuck in the lock, requiring 3 jiggles before the mechanism gave way. The room smelled like decades of cigarette smoke layered underneath industrial cleaner, the 2 scents fighting a war neither could win. The carpet was a brown pattern designed to hide stains, which meant it probably hid decades' worth. The bed sagged in the middle like it had given up on supporting anything, including hopes. A small table sat next to the window with 2 mismatched chairs. A TV from the early 2000s rested on a dresser with drawers that didn't close properly. The bathroom was tiny, with a shower stall that had seen better years, and a mirror that made everything look slightly yellow. This was home now. This was what my life had been reduced to. A room that charged by the week, in a motel where nobody asked questions, because asking questions might require caring about the answers. I tried to establish some kind of routine to keep myself from completely falling apart. I woke up early, made instant coffee using the small machine in the room, and spent mornings applying for jobs online. Marketing coordinator, social media manager, anything remotely related to my experience. I sent out dozens of applications, customizing cover letters, updating my resume. Nobody called back. Nobody even sent rejection emails. My applications disappeared into the digital void, and I heard nothing. In the afternoons, I'd work on whatever. Freelance projects I could find. Small businesses needing someone to manage their Facebook page, write email newsletters, design graphics. The work paid poorly and arrived sporadically, but it was enough to cover the weekly motel rate, with a little leftover for food. Dinner was usually instant ramen. Sometimes I'd splurge on a can of soup or a frozen meal from the convenience store 2 blocks away. I'd eat, sitting on the edge of the bed, watching TV shows I didn't care about, just to have noise that wasn't the sound of my own thoughts. My neighbors were mostly invisible. A long-haul trucker named Dale, who parked his rig in the far corner, would nod sometimes when our paths crossed, but we never spoke. A woman who worked night shifts at the hospital kept her curtains permanently closed. A man in his 60s lived next door and played country music at a volume just low enough that I couldn't complain, but loud enough to seep through the thin walls. I avoided looking at myself in the bathroom mirror. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She had my face, but something fundamental had changed in her eyes. Something had broken and hadn't healed right, leaving her looking hollow and defeated in a way that made me ashamed. This was my life now. This was what betrayal and systematic destruction looked like. A motel room that smelled like smoke and failure. Meals that cost less than $2. And the crushing understanding that nobody was coming to save me because everyone who might have cared had already decided I was too much trouble. I'd been living in room 14 for 3 weeks when I noticed the suitcase under the bed. I only found it because I dropped my phone charger, and it rolled under the bed frame. I got down on my hands and knees, reaching into the dusty space, and my hand hit something solid. Something that shouldn't have been there. I pulled it out into the light. An old suitcase. Battered brown leather, with brass corners oxidized to a dull green. It looked like something from another era. A luggage tag was attached to the handle with twine. And when I turned it over, my hands started shaking. Samantha Marie Garrett. My full name, written in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. The precise, careful script of my Aunt Helen. I sat on the floor, holding the suitcase, trying to make sense of how it got there. Helen had died 9 months ago. I'd attended her funeral, stood at her graveside, watched them lower her casket. She'd lived alone for decades, died alone in her house, surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers. Everyone had said it was sad, but not surprising given how she'd isolated herself with her conspiracy theories and paranoid warnings. How had her suitcase ended up under my bed in a motel room I'd only been living in for 3 weeks? Had she known I'd end up here? Had she left it with Rita at the front desk? The logistics seemed impossible, but the evidence was right in front of me. The suitcase was locked. I turned it over, checking the sides, and found a small plastic bag taped underneath. Inside was a key. Helen had always been paranoid, but also practical. She hid things in plain sight, left clues that required careful observation. I peeled off the tape, removed the key, and unlocked the suitcase with trembling hands. Inside was money. $70,000 in cash, bundled with rubber bands, mostly $100 bills. It smelled faintly of mothballs and old books, like it had been stored somewhere for years. Underneath the money was a plane ticket, printed on paper yellowed at the edges, Portland, Oregon. Departure date, 4 days from now. And beneath the ticket, a handwritten note on yellow legal paper, in Helen's distinctive script, "Samantha, this is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. They've been planning this since before your wedding. Finish what your mother started before they silenced her. The truth is important. Use it wisely." I read those words 3 times, each reading making them feel more impossible and more true at the same time. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. They've been planning this since before my wedding. My mother, Catherine, had died 6 years ago. A car accident. Helen had insisted something was wrong, pulled me aside at the funeral, whispering urgently that my mother had been investigating financial fraud at the pharmaceutical company where she worked, that her death was too convenient. I'd dismissed it as grief. Everyone had. Helen was always seeing conspiracies. Now, I spent that night in room 14, staring at the money and the note, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything except the choice Helen was forcing me to make. By morning, I decided. I wasn't running. I was done being the person things happened to. I was done disappearing while the people who destroyed my life got to move forward without consequences. I packed my duffel bag with the few things that mattered, some clothes, my laptop, the $70,000 bundled in a waterproof bag. I left a note for Rita, saying I'd paid through the week but wouldn't be returning. She looked at me with an expression that might have been concern, or relief that her weekly tenant problem was solving itself. "Good luck," she said. The flight to Portland left early on a Thursday morning from a regional airport. I booked it with Helen's cash, trying not to think about what I was doing. Flying across the country to follow instructions from a dead and everyone called paranoid, chasing a conspiracy theory that connected my husband's affair to my mother's death. Believing that the systematic destruction of my life was part of something bigger. When I said it like that, it sounded crazy. But Helen's note was in my bag. The money was real. The plane ticket had my name on it. Crazy or not, I was going. The airline was one of those budget carriers that charge extra for everything, including the right to breathe. I paid the $15 to bring my duffel bag, then spent 3 hours wedged between a businessman who monopolized both armrests and a college kid watching videos without headphones. I didn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop cycling through questions. What had my mother discovered? How deep did Justin and Natalie's involvement go? Had any part of my relationship with Justin been real? Portland greeted me with gray skies and rain. Colder, heavier, the kind of wet that seeps through clothing. I rented a car with Helen's cash and a maxed-out credit card. The address Helen had written led me out of the city, toward Lake Oswego, a suburb that felt quiet in a way that suggested money and privacy. Helen's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a small ranch built in the 70s, untouched since. The windows were dark. The lawn had grown wild. It screamed, "Someone died here." I parked in the driveway and sat for a minute, engine running, wondering if I was brave enough. Helen's note promised truth. But what if the truth was worse than the lies? I turned off the engine before I could talk myself out of it. The front door was locked, but Helen had left a second key in the suitcase, taped inside a small envelope marked "House." I let myself in, stepping into air that smelled stale and undisturbed. The particular smell of a place where nobody had opened a window or cooked a meal in months. The interior was exactly as described by family, books everywhere, stacked, piled, lining baseboards. Filing cabinets in the living room. The kitchen looked barely used. but the note had directed me to the shed behind the house. I walked through to the back door and stepped into an overgrown yard where grass and weeds had reclaimed what might have been a garden. The shed sat in the far corner, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with newer locks on the door than anything else on the property. That detail stood out. Everything else was neglected, but those locks were industrial, the kind you use when you're protecting something that matters. I used the third key Helen had left, marked shed. It opened smoothly. Inside, the shed was organized in a way that made the house look chaotic. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with years spanning from the 1980s to last year. Boxes were stacked along another wall, indexed with professional precision. And in the back corner, partially hidden under a tarp and some strategically placed paint cans, was a trap door in the floor. I moved the cans and pulled back the tarp. The trap door had a handle and a lock. The fourth key Helen had left opened it, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. I turned on my phone's flashlight and climbed down into what turned out to be a crawl space, converted into a climate-controlled evidence room. The space was 7 feet tall, 15 feet square, lit by battery-powered LED strips that flickered on when I reached the bottom. The air was cool and dry. More filing cabinets, more boxes, a table with a laptop, an old cassette player, and scattered photographs and documents in plastic sleeves. Helen had spent years building this. A secret archive. I started with the photographs, arranged on the table like evidence in a trial. The first one I picked up made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped it. My mother, Catherine, standing between Justin and Natalie at some kind of conference. All three wore name tags and business casual clothing, smiling like well-acquainted colleagues. The banner in the background said Meridian Pharmaceuticals Annual Research Summit. The date printed on the bottom was 8 years ago. 8 years. 2 full years before I'd supposedly met Justin by chance at a dinner party. 2 years before our relationship even started. I stared at that photo, my brain trying to construct explanations, anything to hold on to the narrative I'd believed. Maybe they met briefly. Coincidence. Mislabeled photo. But I knew better. This wasn't coincidence. Justin hadn't met me by accident. He'd been positioned in my life deliberately. Cultivated as a relationship by people who needed access to my mother and saw me as the easiest entry point. I'd been a target before I was a girlfriend. A mark before I was a wife. And every moment of intimacy, every declaration of love, every promise about our future had been performance art, in service of something I was only now beginning to understand. I set down the photograph with shaking hands and reached for the cassette player. It was old, from the 80s, with built-in speakers. Next to it, a stack of tapes, each labeled in Helen's handwriting with dates, names, and brief descriptions. I picked up the first one, Justin Garrett and Richard Moss. March 2019. Discussion of Catherine Vaughn investigation status. My mother's name. My chest tightened. I loaded the tape, pressed play, and heard static, followed by voices that made my hands go cold. The first voice belonged to Justin. I'd heard that voice every day for 7 years. Heard it tell me he loved me. Heard it make promises. Now I was hearing it discuss my mother like she was a problem that needed solving. Catherine's getting too close, Justin said, his tone businesslike, devoid of emotion. She's made copies of the trial data. She's been meeting with someone at the FDA. I don't know who yet, but I'm working on finding out through Samantha. A second voice responded, older, more authoritative. That must be Richard Moss. We can't let this go public. The approvals we've secured are worth billions. If she exposes the data manipulation, we're looking at criminal charges and the end of the company. Can you contain her through the daughter? I've tried, Justin said. But Catherine doesn't discuss work details with Samantha. She's protective. Thinks she's keeping her daughter safe by not involving her in whatever she's investigating. It's actually making my job harder because Samantha doesn't know anything useful. Then we need to consider other options, Richard said. And something in his tone made my blood run cold. More permanent solutions. We can't risk everything because one accountant developed a conscience. I paused the tape. I couldn't breathe. They were discussing killing my mother. planning it like a business decision, weighing options, considering strategies. And Justin, the man I'd married, the man I'd built a life with, was part of that conversation. He'd been using me to gather information. And when that didn't work, he'd participated in planning her murder. I forced myself to press play again. There are ways to make it look accidental, Richard continued. We have people who specialize in this. Car accidents happen all the time, especially on rainy nights on dangerous roads. Nobody questions those. What about afterward? Justin asked. If Catherine dies, Samantha's going to be devastated. She'll lean on me for support, which gives me more access to her life. But there's also that aunt, Helen. She's paranoid and suspicious of everything. If Catherine dies, Helen's going to start asking questions. Let her ask, Richard said dismissively. Nobody takes Helen Vaughn seriously. She's been crying wolf about corporate corruption for decades. If she starts claiming Catherine's death wasn't an accident, people will just think she's being paranoid again. The key is making sure there's nothing concrete for her to find. We clean up thoroughly, make sure the accident investigation is handled by people we can trust, and move on. The recording continued for another 20 minutes, detailing logistics and contingencies, discussing my mother's murder with the same tone people use when planning a vacation or organizing a work project. When it finally ended, I sat in the silence of Helen's underground archive, trying to process what I'd just heard. Justin hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been a plant from the beginning, positioned in my life specifically to monitor my mother's investigation. He'd courted me, proposed to me, married me, all as part of a strategy to gain access to information that might threaten a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme. And when using me didn't work, when my mother kept her investigation separate from her daughter, they made it look like an accident on a rainy night. I found more tapes. Conversations between Natalie and someone named Dr. Sarah Chin, Natalie's aunt, a senior researcher at Meridian. These recordings revealed that Natalie had been assigned to befriend me after my mother's death, to make sure I remained isolated and manageable, to monitor whether I showed any signs of investigating what had really happened. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance. Every heart-to-heart conversation, data collection. Our entire friendship had been fabricated. I don't know how long I sat in that crawl space, listening to recordings, reading documents, piecing together the full scope of what had been done to my mother and to me. Hours, maybe. My back ached from the concrete floor, my eyes burned from reading in the LED light. Finally, I found the laptop Helen had left. It was plugged in, with an arrow pointing to a video file on the desktop labeled, for Samantha. I opened it, and Helen's face filled the screen. She looked exactly as I remembered, though visibly ill. Her face was drawn, her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the camera. But her eyes were sharp, focused. She wore a cardigan I recognized, navy blue with wooden buttons, the same one she'd worn to every family gathering for a decade. Samantha, she began, her voice steady despite the physical deterioration. If you're watching this, it means I'm dead, and you found my archive. Which means you're probably angry and confused, and wondering why I didn't tell you any of this while I was alive. She paused, taking a sip of water. The answer is I tried. I warned you about Justin at your engagement party. I pulled you aside and told you to be careful, that something about him felt wrong. I told you to watch how Natalie behaved around him, to pay attention to the small things that didn't quite add up. You thought I was being paranoid. You said I saw conspiracies everywhere and needed to let you live your own life. Helen's expression softened slightly. And I don't blame you for that. I'd spent decades being the family member everyone described as difficult and eccentric. The one who handed out pamphlets about corporate corruption at Thanksgiving. The one who warned about trusting people with perfect smiles and convenient explanations. By the time I tried to warn you about Justin, you'd already learned to dismiss everything I said as paranoia. She adjusted the camera, leaning forward. Your mother, Catherine, was my best friend long before she was your mother. We grew up protecting each other. And when she discovered what Meridian was doing, she came to me first, because she knew I would help her document everything properly. We spent months building a case, collecting evidence, preparing to go to federal authorities. Then, she died in that convenient accident. And I knew exactly what had happened, even though I couldn't prove it yet. Helen coughed, covering her mouth with a tissue. When she pulled it away, I saw blood. I've spent the last 6 years of my life collecting the evidence you're sitting with right now. Every document, every recording, every financial trail. I did it because I loved your mother and because I love you. Because I couldn't let them get away with killing Catherine and destroying your life without any consequences. She looked directly at the camera, with an intensity that made it feel like she was in the room with me. You have 2 choices, Samantha. Just like your mother had 2 choices before they killed her. You can take the money I left you and disappear. Change your identity, move somewhere far away, live comfortably and safely, and never look back. Nobody would blame you for choosing survival over justice. You've already lost so much. You deserve peace if that's what you want. Helen coughed again, harder this time, pausing. Or you can fight. You can use everything I've collected and burn these people down. Expose Meridian. Expose Justin and Natalie and everyone who participated in your mother's murder and your destruction. It won't be easy. They have money, lawyers, political connections. You'll be threatened. You'll be harassed. You might be in danger. But Samantha, if you fight, you might actually win. And even if you don't win completely, you'll make them pay a price for what they did. She smiled then. That crooked smile I remembered from childhood, when she'd sneak me extra cookies or let me stay up past my bedtime reading. Either way, you'll have a story worth telling. Your mother would be proud of you no matter what you choose. But I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night. Helen's expression became serious again. I love you, Samantha. Don't let them win. She reached for something off camera, then looked back at the screen. Oh, and there's one more thing I haven't mentioned in the written materials. Mountain Pacific Credit Union account number 77743. Password is your mother's employee number from Meridian. That's the real fortune. The $70,000 in the suitcase is just travel money. Use what's in that account to fight or use it to run. But for God's sake, use it. The video ended. I sat staring at the blank screen for a long time. Then I pulled out my phone and searched for Mountain Pacific Credit Union's number. The call to Mountain Pacific Credit Union took 45 minutes of navigating automated menus before I finally reached a human being. I gave them the account number Helen had mentioned, and the representative went quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Ma'am, she said finally, her voice suddenly much more professional, I'm going to need to transfer you to our wealth management division. Please hold. The hold music was classical piano that sounded like it was being played underwater. After what felt like an eternity, a woman named Patricia came on the line and asked me to verify my identity using my mother's employee number as the password. When I gave her the numbers, she paused, then explained, in careful language, that Helen had established a trust in my name. The trust contains stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and intellectual property rights that your mother secured before her death, Patricia said. The total value is approximately $14 million, structured to protect it from legal challenges and ensure that only you can access it. $14 million. The words didn't sound real. They sounded like dialogue from a movie about someone else's life, not mine. I was sitting in a dead woman's underground archive, surrounded by evidence of conspiracy and murder, and now being told I had access to more money than I could properly comprehend. Helen had spent 6 years not just collecting evidence, but building a financial foundation that would allow me to fight without being destroyed by legal fees and endless court battles. She'd wrapped justice like a gift, leaving it with enough resources to actually achieve it. I chose to fight. Using the contact information Helen had left in her files, I called Agent Maria Torres at the FBI's Portland field office. She answered on the third ring with a tone that suggested she was busy. This is Torres. My name is Samantha Garrett, I said, my voice shaking slightly. My Aunt Helen Vaughn left me information about a case I think you've been trying to build about Meridian Pharmaceuticals. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked my phone. Where are you right now? Maria asked, her tone completely changed. At my aunt's property. Don't leave. I'm coming to you. Don't talk to anyone else. Don't touch anything else. Just wait for me. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She hung up before I could respond. Maria arrived in 35 minutes, which suggested she'd driven faster than was legal. She was in her late 40s, with gray streaking through dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a blazer with an FBI badge clipped to her belt. She looked at me, standing in Helen's overgrown backyard, with an expression that was part skepticism, part hope. "Show me," she said. I led her to the shed, down the ladder, into the underground archive. I watched her face change as she took in the filing cabinets, the boxes, the organized documentation of 6 years of investigation. She put on latex gloves before touching anything, pulling out files and reading with an intensity that made me understand why Helen had trusted her. "Your aunt was either the most thorough investigator I've ever encountered, or she was completely brilliant," Maria said after 20 minutes. "Probably both. This is enough to open a federal investigation. We're talking conspiracy charges, fraud, possibly murder if we can prove the car accident was arranged. Samantha, you just handed me a case that could take down a major pharmaceutical company." The investigation that followed moved with a bureaucratic slowness that Maria assured me was normal. Building cases against corporations with billions in assets and armies of lawyers required patience and meticulous attention. Subpoenas had to be drafted, reviewed, approved. Bank records needed freezing, which required warrants, which required probable cause, which required more paperwork than I'd thought existed. Former Meridian employees who'd been fired or quit under suspicious circumstances were interviewed. The pharmaceutical industry's informal network of whistleblowers started emerging, sharing their own stories of fraud and retaliation. Maria helped me find a small apartment in Portland, a one-bedroom in an old building with hardwood floors that creaked and windows that rattled when trains passed. It was infinitely better than room 14 at the Crossroads Motel, but I kept it modest. I used money from Helen's trust to pay rent and buy groceries, living simply while the investigation moved forward. I met with prosecutors every few weeks, answering detailed questions about every piece of evidence Helen had collected. They wanted to know about Justin's schedule, Natalie's visits, my mother's behavior. I answered everything, watching them take notes, exchanging glances that suggested they were building something substantial. Maria called periodically with updates that mostly consisted of, "We're making progress, and don't talk to anyone about this." It was what federal agents say when they can't share details, but want you to know you haven't been forgotten. The waiting was harder than anything that had come before. I'd handed over everything Helen had collected, and now I was just existing in limbo, hoping that the machinery of justice would actually work for once, instead of grinding up innocent people and spitting them out. Then, months after I'd first met Maria in Helen's archive, things started happening with the kind of speed that suggested the government had finally accumulated enough evidence to move forward confidently. It began on a Wednesday morning in early spring. Meridian Pharmaceuticals' headquarters got raided by federal agents, who carried boxes out of a gleaming glass building that looked like a monument to corporate success. The images made national news, showing employees looking confused and scared while FBI agents in windbreakers methodically dismantled what had seemed like an untouchable empire. Richard Moss, the CEO whose voice I'd heard on Helen's recordings discussing my mother's murder like a minor inconvenience, was arrested at his home. News cameras caught footage of him being led out in handcuffs, past neighbors, past reporters shouting questions he didn't answer, past a life built on fraud that was now collapsing in real time. Maria called me that afternoon to tell me Justin had been arrested at his office at a tech startup where he'd been working since the divorce. I watched the footage on the local news that evening, rewinding it multiple times, because apparently I developed an unhealthy coping mechanism around witnessing karma manifest in handcuffs and perp walks. Justin maintained his composure, didn't speak to reporters, walked with his head up like he was enduring a minor inconvenience rather than being arrested for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. But I could see something in his eyes that looked like fear mixed with disbelief. Like he genuinely thought he was untouchable and was only now realizing how wrong he'd been. Natalie was arrested 2 days later at a coffee shop in Seattle, where she'd apparently moved after the divorce. She'd used her Meridian payments to fund a graphic design business that was actually legitimate this time. According to the news reports, she cried during her arrest. The tears felt performative to me, given she'd testified against me in divorce court without showing a single genuine emotion. Her attorney issued a statement claiming she'd been manipulated by Justin, had no idea about the extent of the conspiracy, that she was a victim. But I'd heard the recordings of her conversations with Dr. Sarah Chin. I'd read the documents showing payments made specifically to maintain her friendship with me as a monitoring operation. Natalie hadn't been a victim. She'd been a willing participant who'd cultivated our friendship deliberately to ensure I remained isolated and manageable after my mother's death. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance. Every conversation where she'd encouraged me to trust Justin, to ignore my instincts, to believe that my marriage problems were normal, had been calculated manipulation. The betrayal from Natalie cut deeper than Justin's in some ways. I'd chosen to marry Justin, but Natalie had been assigned to me without my knowledge or consent. Our entire friendship had been fabricated from the beginning. Then came the news about Judge Robert Cunningham. He resigned from the bench with a statement about wanting to spend more time with family, what corrupt officials say when they're hoping resignation will prevent criminal prosecution. It didn't work. He was indicted 3 weeks later for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. Documents Helen had collected showed he'd purchased a vacation home through a trust that traced back to Meridian. He'd been ruling in favor of corporate interests for years in exchange for payments disguised as consulting fees. Every case he'd presided over in the last decade was reviewed. My divorce case was among the first. A new judge took 15 minutes to determine that the original ruling had been based on fabricated testimony and biased proceedings. Everything Cunningham had decided was vacated, erased, like it had never happened. Maria called me the day my case review was completed. "Your marriage to Justin is being annulled rather than finalized as a divorce," she said. "The court's declaring it invalid from the beginning due to fraud. You're also getting a formal apology from the judicial system, for whatever that's worth." It was worth something. Not enough to undo the damage or erase the months of suffering, but something. The formal apology arrived as a letter on official court stationery, signed by 3 judges. It acknowledged I'd been subjected to proceedings fundamentally compromised by corruption and fabricated testimony. It expressed regret for the harm caused by a system that had failed to protect me. It was 2 pages of careful legal language, trying to convey remorse without admitting liability. I read it once and filed it away with all the other documents that marked the destruction and slow rebuilding of my life. The apology didn't erase the trauma of watching my best friend lie, or the humiliation of losing everything because a judge had been bought. But it was acknowledgement. Official recognition that what had been done to me was wrong. The trials began 6 months after the arrests and stretched for a year and a half. Maria had warned me that cases this complex moved slowly. She was right. The legal process ground forward with a bureaucratic thoroughness that made glaciers look fast. Richard Moss went to trial first. His case became a media spectacle. Pharmaceutical industry whistleblowers testified about the culture of fraud at Meridian. Patients harmed by medications that should never have reached the market shared their stories. Forensic accountants explained money trails that connected executive bonuses directly to fraudulent approvals. The jury deliberated for 6 days, then returned with guilty verdicts on 17 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and reckless endangerment. Richard Moss showed no visible emotion. He stood while the judge read the sentence: 23 years in federal prison and forfeiture of approximately $40 million in assets. He was 62. He'd likely spend the rest of his life incarcerated. I watched the sentencing from the gallery in the back row. When the judge finished and the bailiffs led Moss away, I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, not quite closure. It was more like watching a long mathematical equation finally balance. Justin's trial was smaller, quieter, but more personal for me. I attended every day, sitting in the same seat, watching prosecutors present evidence of his role in monitoring my mother, his participation in planning her murder, his 7-year marriage to me as an extended intelligence gathering operation. The recordings Helen had collected were played in court. I listened to Justin's voice discussing my mother like she was an obstacle, strategizing how to use our relationship for information. Bank records showed payments made to him throughout our marriage, demonstrating he'd been compensated for every month he'd spent pretending to love me. His attorney tried to argue he was a low-level participant, coerced. But the recordings showed someone enthusiastic and willing. The jury returned guilty verdicts on conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Justin looked at me across the courtroom. His expression was complicated: anger, resignation, disbelief. Like he couldn't believe the woman he'd married as part of a surveillance operation had been the one to bring the evidence that destroyed him. I looked back, without blinking, without emotion. I was done being intimidated by people who had systematically underestimated what I was capable of. Natalie accepted a plea deal. In exchange for testimony against other defendants, her sentence was reduced to 8 years. She provided information about Dr. Sarah Chin and other Meridian employees, helping prosecutors build cases against people who might otherwise have escaped accountability. 6 months after her sentencing, I received a letter from her. 3 pages on prison stationery, full of apologies and explanations about how she'd been young, desperate for money, how she'd made terrible choices. How being assigned to befriend me had started as just a job, but had become complicated when she'd actually grown to care about me despite the lies. She asked if we could eventually find a way to forgive each other. I read the letter once, sitting in my Portland apartment with morning coffee, and felt nothing but a hollow kind of satisfaction. It was self-justification dressed up in remorse, trying to rewrite history so Natalie could see herself as a victim of circumstances, not an active participant in destroying another person's life. She wanted absolution I wasn't willing to give. I filed the letter away with other evidence of betrayal and never responded. Some relationships can't be repaired and shouldn't be. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who systematically destroyed your life just because they later regret getting caught. The civil lawsuit against Meridian Pharmaceuticals took another 2 years to resolve. The company fought aggressively, deploying teams of lawyers to challenge every claim. But eventually, facing the weight of evidence that had already resulted in criminal convictions for their executives, they settled. The terms required Meridian to pay $2.7 billion to patients who'd been harmed by their fraudulent drug approvals. They had to fund independent safety reviews of every medication they brought to market in the past decade. They were placed under federal monitoring for 15 years. My mother's estate received $12 million in wrongful death damages. I inherited it as her only living relative. And I donated every single dollar to organizations that advocate for pharmaceutical safety and transparency. The money felt tainted, earned through my mother's murder. And I already had enough resources from Helen's trust to live comfortably. Instead, I used part of Helen's trust to start the Vaughn Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to investigating pharmaceutical fraud and supporting whistleblowers. We hired investigators, funded legal defenses, published reports that made pharmaceutical companies uncomfortable. The foundation became my full-time work, my way of channeling grief and anger into something productive. Something that would have made my mother and Helen proud. Something that turned their deaths into a legacy that actually helped people, instead of just being tragic endings. I still think about room 14 at the Crossroads Motel. Sometimes, about sitting on that sagging bed, eating instant ramen with a plastic fork, wondering if I'd ever climb out of the hole my life had become. I keep the receipt from my last week there in my wallet. A reminder that rock bottom is real. That humiliation and betrayal can strip away everything you thought defined you. But they can't actually destroy you. Unless you let them. Helen had understood that. She'd spent her final years building a case and assembling resources because she believed truth mattered more than comfort, and justice mattered more than safety. She'd been right. The paranoid and everyone dismissed had been the only one who truly understood how the world worked. Who recognized that powerful people don't stop being corrupt just because you trust them or play by rules they ignore. The final truth Helen left me proved prophetic in ways I'm still discovering. Fighting doesn't always lead to winning, but not fighting guarantees losing. I built a meaningful life from the ruins of a fraudulent one. Messy, complicated, and fundamentally honest. The kind of ending my mother and Helen would have appreciated. The kind of story that reminds people that patience and documentation can topple empires built on lies. And that sometimes, the greatest revenge is simply refusing to let corrupt people erase you from the narrative they've constructed around their own importance. I'm not the woman I was when I found that suitcase under the motel bed. I'm stronger than she was. More careful about trust, but also more certain about what matters. That woman didn't understand how much she could survive or how powerful she could become when everything else had been stripped away. I'm grateful I'm not her anymore. If this story of justice and resilience captivated you until the very end, please show your support by hitting that like button right now. My favorite part was when Samantha discovered Helen's underground archive and realized her paranoid and had been right about everything all along. What was your favorite moment? Thanks for watching. Take care.